Ladies and gentlemen, a real pleasure to be here. My first trip to India, and so far it's everything that I thought it would be, and I'm just looking forward to seeing more, and quite delighted to have the opportunity to speak to this very distinguished group in this very interesting part of the world. I'm going to talk about strategy, and in the context of much of what has just been said, what General Malik said, what the Defense Minister said earlier this morning, and which will be certainly repeated many times today. And that is that clearly we're in a period of significant change. There's change in technology, in communications, in social mores, all kinds of change. People can only put up with a certain amount of change. When it becomes too excessive, people tend to go into almost a state of shell shock, if you will, and they stop functioning. So in some respects, the more change that exists in the world, the more important it is to have something stable that will help us deal with the changes that are taking place around us and deal with them in such a way that you have a control over your future, as opposed to being thrown about by the gusts of randomness that can easily take you to places where you really don't want to go. And to me, what that really comes down to is a fairly straightforward, fairly simple process of strategy. And that's what I want to discuss today in an outline form. My first real experience with strategy in war was in Vietnam, almost 30 years ago. I flew a little over 200 combat missions during that particular conflict. I thought I flew pretty well. Yeah, I thought everybody with whom I was flying was doing well. I thought the people on the ground were doing well. The people at sea were doing well. And in fact, if you looked at it, that we really won virtually all of the battles in which we participated. And we didn't win them by just a little bit. We won them rather dramatically by any kind of historical norms. And yet, in 1975, the North Vietnamese marched into Saigon and promptly changed the name to Ho Chi Minh City, which, of course, was the right of the conqueror. Why did they succeed, and why did we fail? To me, the answer comes down to one simple word, and that word is strategy. That they had a strategy which allowed them to be successful even despite the fact that their tactical capability was quite limited, especially in comparison to their opponent. We didn't succeed because of one word, and that one word was strategy, that our strategy was deficient enough that it could not be rescued even with the most extraordinary tactical capabilities that range from the air to the ground to the sea. The experience that I have had since Vietnam, up through the first Gulf War, and then subsequently in working with a lot of large corporations around the world in helping to develop strategy, has really led me to the conclusion that when you get right down to it, that strategy is very simply the sine qua non, that without's nothing, of success. If you got good strategy, you're probably going to do okay. If you don't, the chances that you will do well are simply rather low. Tactics are certainly important. It's certainly important to fly airplanes well, to shoot well, to ride well, to make good sales calls, to make good marketing pitches. All the rest of those things extraordinarily important. But my observation is that the best of tactics are unlikely to bring you success unless that they are in the service of a truly good, comprehensive strategy. So if we're talking about strategy, we would start off with a simple definition. And the simple definition, I think, is that strategy is nothing more than a game plan to create a future that otherwise would not exist. It wouldn't come about simply on its own. Now, you might ask whether we're talking about business strategy or military strategy or political strategy or any other adjective that you might want to put on it. My answer is that if you're really talking about strategy, that strategy is strategy. That strategy has to do with competition. And it doesn't make any difference whether the tactical form of the competition is the sales call or the air-to-air engagement, that the overlying strategy concepts are simply identical. Likewise, with reference to clearly the changing nature of war and the fact that things are fought in much different ways today than they were in the past, I'm not at all sure that those changes have not been primarily at a tactical level, and that the strategy that would work today is the same strategy that would have worked 2,000 years ago. Presumably the strategy that would work today would be the same one that would work 2,000 years into the future, because there are concepts and theories of strategy that, if properly employed, will allow you to be successful and deal with the varying tactics that are part of whatever it is that you are doing. In fact, I would say from a personal standpoint that of all of the, if you will, of the great strategic leaders, the one that I still find to be the most relevant is the one that you all had a little bit of experience with some time ago, and that was Alexander the Great. That as a strategist, I think he is unmatched. Were his tactics good? Yes, his tactics were good, but the tactics were not the thing that brought him the successes that he achieved. Now, if you don't have strategy in an organization, whether that organization is a business, an army, an air force, a country, or whatever it is, you really are dependent on luck or genius for success. Now both luck and genius happen in the real world, but they're statistically unlikely, and they are unlikely to occur when you really need them. People, unfortunately, despite the importance of strategy, don't think very much about it. Most organizations with which I've had any contact, or which I've read about at any rate, don't think or act very strategically. And instead, what that they tend to do is to leap from a rather vague objective for what they would like to accomplish immediately into a choice of one tactic or another. And the tactic that they normally choose is the one with which they have familiarity, the one that they used in some point in the past, or which is the favorite of whomever the most influential proponent is of that particular approach. Now, I think one of the reasons why that we have so much problem with strategy is that as humans, we're extraordinarily good at a tactical level. In fact, we wouldn't be around if we weren't so good. When a tiger comes along that looks hungry, we need to do something about it. When we need to cross the streets, whether it's here in New Delhi or whether it's in New York, if you don't do that right, if you're not tactically proficient, you don't make it across the street, and tomorrow becomes rather irrelevant. So we've become quite good at dealing with that. But strategy, which takes place over a long period of time, incorporates many crossings of streets, etc., is a little bit different kind of a thing. Even our education system really drives us away from strategic thinking. Education tends to be extraordinarily inductive, looking at a lot of little facts and bringing facts up into a single discipline, rarely integrating over multiple disciplines, whereas strategy, to be effective, really needs to be highly integrative over multiple subjects and multiple disciplines. Within our organizations themselves, whether they're business, military, or politics, that we tend to reward and promote people to leadership positions based on tactical success. They ride a horse well in the past, they fly an airplane well in today's world, they manage small projects well, they manage even battles well. And yet, when we get down to it, it's none of those things that by themselves are going to lead to organizational success, because strategy and tactics are simply not the same thing. And yet, when people who have been promoted because of their tactical success all of a sudden have strategic responsibilities, their tendency is to think about their job as an expanded tactical problem over what they previously were dealing with, use the same concepts, the same approaches. They can't do it. Strategy and tactics are simply not the same thing. Winning battles is not necessarily even the thing that is going to bring a country, a state, or a group success in a larger sense. If we think about two generals, for example, whom are normally considered to be the greatest of all time, let's say Hannibal and Napoleon, to take a couple thousand-year stretch of time, both of those were brilliant tacticians, brilliant battle winners, brilliant battle leaders. And yet you would have to say that from a strategic standpoint, both of them were utter and complete disasters as far as their countries were concerned. Strategy and tactics are simply not the same thing. People in an organization, whether they are at the top, end up making decisions that have strategic impact whether they know it or not. If people in an organization really don't know what the strategy is and are not signed up for it, that the kinds of decisions they make are likely to be at best counterproductive and at worst something far beyond merely being a little counterproductive. Now, if you're going to have a strategy, I think that in a way that it is extraordinarily important to have a process for developing strategy within an organization. The reason I say this is because if you don't have a process that people can understand and agree and can use at varying levels, then the strategy construction business becomes one of whoever happens to be the leader of the day or a small group of leaders of the day making some decision and going off in a particular direction, which may be difficult for others to understand, difficult to replicate, even difficult for those who created the strategy to understand how they did it and how they got there and to know whether they are being successful. So an organization needs a strategy. It has to have characteristics. The characteristics are that it must be one that approaches the world from an architectural standpoint, not from a bricklayer standpoint. An architect thinks about the future, thinks about what the purpose is going to be of the structure, how it's going to be used, who it's going to use it, what it's going to cost, and a variety of other things like that before making a decision as to whether bricks are going to be employed or glass or wood or whatever it may happen to be. On the other hand, a bricklayer puts a brick down and then puts another brick on top. And if that's the right place and the right time and the right material, it'll work out okay. So strategy must start off with an architectural approach, and it must address 4 questions. I think you can consider strategy as at its basic level really being the answer to 4 one-word questions. And those are where, what, how, exit. Where do we intend to be in the future? What are we going to put our resources against? How are we going to apply our resources in what period of time? And exit. Do we have agreed exit points and plans for everything that may arise? We think about the where as a future picture. We think about it as a future picture because our first step is really in deciding where we want to be in the future is having a very, very clear, high-resolution, comprehensive, measurable picture of what that tomorrow is going to be. If it's not measurable, it's not going to happen. You're not going to know that you are moving towards it. If it is not multidimensional, you run the risk of sending yourself down a path that may produce success along that path, but may not really lead to what you otherwise would like. So as an interesting example of taking a single path for a strategy, we might even look at the United States and Great Britain during World War II, whose major strategic objective was the defeat of Germany and Japan and their unconditional surrender, as opposed to thinking about what kind of world that they wanted to follow the end of that particular conflict. Once we know what our future picture is, then we need to think about how do you get to a future picture? How do you get to someplace different from where you are today? And the first thing I think is extraordinarily important to consider is that everything we do takes place in the context of a system. We function as a system, as a state, as a military, as a company, even as an individual and as a family. We're functioning as part of a system. And we are functioning in part of a larger system, the world system, world markets, whatever our particular interest is going to be. It's obvious that those systems must change in some way if you are going to achieve a future picture that currently does not exist. It's impossible to get to someplace different if the systems do not change. So we need to change the systems, and again, really important to think about changing systems on a large scale and staying away from single point operations. So as an example of a place where that didn't work out so well, the Japanese made a very successful attack on Pearl Harbor and on the Philippines in 1941, but that had little impact on the United States as a system. So as a result, within 4 months, the United States was on a counteroffensive that 4 years later ended up in Tokyo, because there simply had been little system impact from those tactical endeavors of the Japanese. Systems, especially external ones, can seem extraordinarily complex, and they are. Fortunately, that we believe that all systems have the same patterns of organization. We talk about them as having 5 rings of organization, a leadership ring, a process ring, an infrastructure ring, a population ring, and finally an action unit or fielded forces ring on the outside. Using that pattern, which seems to apply quite nicely whether you're talking about a market, a business, an Al-Qaeda, or anything else, you can find the centers of gravity that are necessary to create the system change needed to get you to your future picture. Centers of gravity are leverage points. There are not a lot that even for a very large problem, that the number of centers of gravity that need to be dealt with are a tiny fraction of the total number of tactical entities that exist within that particular system, whether it is external and internal. There are always more than one center of gravity, however, that you have to deal with, and the likelihood of system change is going to be a function of how many of those centers of gravity you change in what period of time. When we're going through this particular process, after having identified a future picture, we then say, how do the systems need to change? Then we say, how do the centers of gravity need to change? To what must they change? And the very last thing that we consider are the tactics that we might use to change the centers of gravity. By taking this particular approach, we know we keep ourselves always functioned at a high strategic level and don't make tactical decisions until really the last minute in our planning. When we then move into the actual changing of systems, we come to our third question, and that is the how question. How are we going to apply our resources, and how are we going to manage the time? I start with the one premise in here, and that time is the enemy of enterprise. If you take a long time to do something, even if it requires a long time, your probability of being successful is going to drop off dramatically the longer the time that you spend, and your cost of operations, whether those are dollars or lives or whatever else it may be, are going to go up a lot. Time is the enemy. You cannot have strategy without a time element on it, and a strategy without time is not strategy. It's as simple as that. And then finally, our last question is exit. Do we have an exit? Have we identified exit points and exit plans for everything that we're going to do? This is the hardest part of strategy. Nobody wants to think about end games, even successful end games. They don't want to think about things going wrong. And what we know is that if you try to think about end games at the time when they are needed, that the emotions that then prevail make rational thought almost impossible. So therefore, strategy requires the development of exit points and exit plans at the very beginning, basically at the same time that you are developing your future picture. If you don't do it up front, you're not going to do it. Strategy demands exit thinking, and if you are not good at exit thinking and exit points, then you're probably not a strategist. It comes down to being something quite simple. Once that we have gone through this particular process, then we can start thinking about risk, reward, cost. It's always all three of those that are involved with any enterprise at any level. There is, obviously, there's direct cost. If you lose a war, there's a direct cost. If you fail to achieve a business objective, there are going to be losses in terms of stockholders and investors, et cetera. There are also consequential risks and consequential costs that take place, which we probably don't give a lot of thought to. These are especially important in geopolitics. So we do something that seems to make perfectly good sense, and then all of a sudden we find that it has produced a reaction that doesn't make very good sense at all from our particular perspective. The German violation of Belgian neutrality in 1914 is an excellent example. From a military standpoint, the violation of Belgian neutrality made perfectly good sense, and there was virtually no military risk associated with that particular operation. But it had the consequence of leading the British to make the decision to join the French and to intervene, and they happened to do it at just the time that the Schlieffen Plan could not put up with any sort of delay, and that risk-free operation of violating Belgian neutrality actually ends up, to some extent, probably costing Germany the war. You've got to do careful risk-cost analysis. One of the problems we encounter, however, is that people at decision levels do not like to hear about risks. once they've made a decision about something, that they are inclined to say, well, we're going to do this, and anybody that brings up any questions or doubts about it is considered something less than a team player or whatever. And they have a tendency then to shoot the messenger. Well, there's a problem when you start shooting messengers that bring the risk message to you. You're going to find it's pretty difficult to hire very many people who want to take on that particular job. So as a result, you rather rapidly find yourself in a decision-making position with nobody that is going to stand up and tell you, hey, you're heading in the wrong direction. You can't, however, make good risk-cost-reward analyses unless you really understand your future picture. You've got to have a good future picture, and you have got to have a value on it. Otherwise, everything that you're doing is just action without an end purpose. If an organization is going to be successful with strategy, as many people as possible really need to understand the strategy. The best way to get people to understand the strategy is to have them participate in putting it together. Now, your first thought might be, well, how can a large organization like a country, et cetera, have a lot of people participating? And the answer is that you've got to do it by cross-sections. So when you're formulating national strategy, for example, whether it's a military operation, an economic operation, or any other kind of a geopolitical initiative, it becomes very important to have a large cross-section of the government, and preferably even people outside the government, including the chief executive, participate in the development of the strategy and to go through it in a methodical way. What we found is that you can bring a lot of people together if that there is a method for strategy. We call this method open planning and operations. We used this particular approach in planning the first Gulf War, which was rather interesting through a variety of circumstances that I won't relate. We ended up having a call from General Schwarzkopf to our Air Force Chief of Staff on the 8th of August of 1990, asking for assistance with some ideas as to what General Schwarzkopf might do at a time when nothing looked particularly attractive. Had started working on some ideas, and the Chief of Staff was aware of it, so he called me into his office right after the conversation and recounted and said, can you put something together for General Schwarzkopf? And I said, yeah, I think so. And he said, can you do it in a couple days? And I said, being, of course, a sort of a modest fighter pilot sort of a fellow, I said, sure, no problem at all. 2 days to put a war plan together? Why not? So off we went and did it. My first inclination was to pull a small number of people that I knew very well together and close the doors, put a guard on the outside, and do this thing. That would have been the stupidest possible way to have approached the problem. Instead, what we did was we took over one of the big briefing rooms, a really large room, about half the size of this, in one of my divisions in the basement of the Pentagon, and opened the doors. Said, hey, if you're interested, if you're in the Pentagon, you're in uniform, and you have some ideas, come on in. By the end of our second day of planning, we had almost 300 people participating in that open planning operation. Now, we were able to do it and keep it from being chaos because there was a process. There are not a lot of potential future pictures that are reasonable. There are not a lot of systems that you need to deal with. There are not a lot of centers of gravity that you need to deal with. So you can actually get a large group to agree on these things pretty darn quickly, and then as you've agreed, you can start breaking up into smaller groups in order to start working out the tactics. Significant advantages from taking this sort of an approach, and those significant advantages include, first of all, that your planning goes dramatically faster than it otherwise might, in part because if you have a reasonably good-sized group of people participating, there is probably an answer to almost any question that you may have that is resonant in that group of people. And if there isn't, there will be somebody in that room that knows somebody someplace around the world that they can call and get an answer. And we certainly found that to be the case. The second huge advantage of open planning is that the people that participate end up with a very, very high level of commitment to what that they have decided. After all, that they participated in creating it, so then they feel a genuine responsibility for it. And then the third thing that happens is that as those people subsequently assume responsibility for subordinate operations, some of them perhaps even quite tactical, they understand exactly how to put those operations together and how to change them as required because they have an in-depth understanding of the strategy which is overarching and is directing them. So open planning and operations, absolutely essential. We actually ended up, before it was all over, having that open planning, including people from the White House, from all the intelligence agencies, the Secretary of Defense, all of the services, and a variety of other people, some of whom were not even connected with the government. Made a huge difference in our ability to put something together and to keep it on track. The last thing that I think really needs to happen in the context of planning is a red team operation. And there are a lot of ways to do a red team, but the essence of a red team is very simply to say, okay, we've got a plan, all looks good, we all agree, now let's attack it. And whether you attack it yourself or bring in an external group, it doesn't make any difference. But you've got to attack it. Everything needs to be on the table, and this needs to be done in the presence of the person who is the primary decision maker, whether that's a president, a prime minister, or at a lower level, depending on what the operation is. It has to be attacked. It has to be attacked unmercifully, and every objection needs to be addressed in a rational way. Red teams are a little exasperating if you're on the receiving end, but they make a heck of a difference in ensuring that you have thought through all of the things that can go wrong before they go wrong in a place that's going to cost you money, lives, business, or whatever it is that you are trying to accomplish. So, I mean, we could obviously talk, I could talk at any rate, for a long time about strategy. It's something that I think is very important. But I want to finish off by just emphasizing a few particular ideas. And that is, whether you use a process like this or whether you use some other process, you have got to have strategy. It must be understood throughout your organization, and that means down to very, very low levels. You have got to approach it from the standpoint of an architect. Bricklaying and strategy simply do not go together. We tend to be bricklayers. You've got to focus on the future. It's the future where value is to be found, not in the past, and the focus needs to be on the future. You have got to have a really good, comprehensive, measurable future picture, and you need to know what its value is. You've got to be a little bit careful of utopian future pictures, and you can sort of use the judgment that if it hadn't happened in 10,000 years, it's probably not likely to happen tomorrow. You've got to remember that time is your enemy. And again, it may take a long time to do something, but the longer that you take, the lower your probability of success is going to be. And this applies to both sides at the same time, whether we're talking about business competition, military, or geopolitical. You need to have an end game for success and for failure. In fact, we'd probably make as many mistakes in failing to have an end game for success, which then leads us into what we typically call mission creep, as we do for having end games for failure. You need to put these together before that they're needed. Once that they're needed, it's virtually impossible to put the emotional energy and the rationality into it to make them happen. And finally, strategy, when you get right down to it, is a mind exercise. It's not a heart exercise. It may be inspired by the heart, but it's a thinking exercise if you're going to be successful. Now, this methodology that we just discussed found that it works. It works in a great variety of different places, from high-level political in the White House to business to the military, etc. But if you don't use it, you still need to, in some form, address those four questions of where, what, how, and exit. Good strategy is not going to guarantee success, but it will give you the best possible chance of success with the least possible risk. It really is the sine qua non. You've got to have it. And there really, in my view, is no excuse not to spend the time up front to think it through clearly and to create it. Thank you very much.